Let's do this Bret Baier one because I mean, lost in all of this is just like there's this Washington Post story about there is a cycle of sorts that involves the Gulf Stream as it crosses as it comes up from the Gulf and crosses the Atlantic. There's certain heat in the water. It changes. And when it is got salt in it still and hasn't evaporated, it will sink. And the water temperatures are in this sort of delicate balance that have to do with water that comes from the south up to the north. And apparently scientists are now becoming alarmed because they are seeing indications. It's very hard to measure, but they're seeing indications apparently that suggest that it could be they've anticipated that this could get screwed up in 300 years, but now they're starting to see indications that maybe it's terminal right now. This cycle, essentially. And this cycle, if it ends, is not something that repairs because it's sort of like a self-perpetuating, there's a certain amount of inertia, I guess, in the way that this functions. And could leave Europe just incredibly frigid in the winters. I mean, just like unbearably frigid. This on top of, I think it's part of some of the report from the IPCC that suggests that things are speeding up faster than we had anticipated. And yet, here's Bret Baier reporting it on Fox. Remember, I mean, the Republicans are the only major party in the world, political party, that deny climate change. I don't know where where they are on their trajectory of denial right now, whether it's sort of like, well, it's happening, but it's not man-made, or it's happening and it's man-made, but we can't do anything about it. I'm not sure. But here is Bret Baier.
Tonight, a United Nations report says the Earth is getting hotter than even most scientists predicted at this point, and that it is definitely the fault of humans. That's what the report says. This occurs as extreme weather around the planet sparks alarm throughout the global warming community. We'll talk live with the Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm in just a moment. First with the story, here's correspondent Benjamin Hall.
Well, just the global warming community.
AKA everyone but the people not getting vaccines.
Right.
I would like to see that overlap. Like, where's the vaccine denial? And I know there is like there's a little sliver that is leftist and, anti-pharmaceutical, whatever. But I would like to know what the overlap is, because that is the future of the political right, in my opinion, that base.
And even if it's not, I mean, that's what's so disturbing, though, in terms of like our prospects for addressing this. Because if you can't convince people that you should just wear a mask during a pandemic, how do you convince people that something that they can't see the totality of, or even remotely close to it, how do you convince them to, that we as a society need to do something? It just terrifies me.
I went on this tour like last week, the antiquities in Greece, and I had this expert. He's actually a philosopher, which I guess you can get a degree in Greece and actually have a job, doing. But it's always been this way. There's always been, you can't convince. I mean, this is I think the problem with Democrats and progressives. We want to convince everybody. We remember, I mean, there's always going to be a faction that sinks democracy or whatever semblance of democracy we have, a republic. There's always going to be a faction that's just going to take us down. The question is, what do we do with that faction? How do we make sure the power's moving so that they're not holding us hostage to our, I mean, it's our demise is really coming down to that. It's a small faction in Hungary that put Orban in place and divided, the left there, divided the left in France right now, the anti-vax protests, the Le Pen protests that are, and the left divided there, the left divided in UK. Like, we could go on and on and on and on. This is not the time for the left to be debating over whether or not we should have a French commune or not. It's how do we deal with this extremely vocal, powerful minority that is completely allergic to any sort of logic and always has been throughout history. What do we do with that?
Yeah, and what's fascinating to me about the through lines of like that anti-science denial when it comes to COVID and vaccines and climate change is it's just like the fear of anything disrupting what is known with an unknown, right? Where the vaccine, you didn't know it your entire life. You've never heard of it. It wasn't a part of your doctor's visits, and it's something new that's been introduced, and thus it must be threatening. And now there's something we may have to adapt to when it comes to climate change, and that's threatening. It's a fear-based freak out that it's exacerbated and multiplied by media figures and people in office. But I'm like, what do you do when people are so afraid and then
But I think
it's interesting.
antagonism towards liberal culture and they identify it as with that fear?
Anti-establishment, right?
right.
It's all anti-establishment. And government doesn't mean establishment. That's, I think, the difference. There's some leftists who believe government can do good if we are empowered to do that good. The state can actually do better than the capitalists. You have this populist population that is not able to differentiate big business from state and doesn't trust either one of them because they think they're influencing each other.
Or some people.
I mean, I think to a certain extent, I mean, some of that's true. I mean, I do think that, like, I don't think being skeptical or nervous about the vaccine in and of itself in a vacuum was wrong, right? Like, I mean, it is, but, and particularly, 7 months ago, I mean, I think, like, the idea that they developed this quickly is, is tricky, but, and you hadn't heard about mRNA, let's say, but at one point, then you start to realize, like, okay, now we've had tens, hundreds of millions of people take this. And there are two things that we can observe. We can observe how people are reacting to the vaccine, and we can observe how people are reacting to COVID. Right? At one point, like, you start to just, it just becomes a sort of a calculation. And there's a lot of people who are just completely misinformed. And they're living in this sort of like bubble where their information, I mean, that is the scariest part, is that aside from like whatever emotional response they have to some things, there's no mechanism in which to reach them, to have them have a more rational reaction.
Mm-hmm. This is it, Sam, though. This is it. It's not an accident. It's not just like, oh, they're misinformed because they have idiots on Facebook who are sharing things.
I understand.
There is a mechanism. And the problem is that our government right now in the US is so, when we talk about Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema holding up our government right now, they're holding up any potential looking into of the monopolies that are controlling our ecosystem that's sharing information. We know very well it's not just Facebook, it's Twitter, it's YouTube. There is an overwhelming presence on the right and a boosting of the right, whether it's from capital simultaneously feeding in and like organizing around these algorithms. That is a thing, and it's happening internationally. The difference is somewhere like in the EU, they can actually regulate because they don't have to deal with the filibuster. They don't have to deal with campaign finance. And they're just starting to catch up to it here in a way that, like, we, some of us have been, but we're frozen. We're frozen.
Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.